maybe 8 welds. But they have a whole facility down at Quonset Point to get that extreme circularity you need for a good pressure hull. In steel, they have an indoor building that costs $200 million down at Quonset Point so they can weld these things. And so they weren't using Electro Slag, they were using Gas Metal Arc on the steel, but you could do that with Electro Slag. And the Soviets, Patan Institute was the leader in Electro Slag technology in the whole world. And Gurevich had quit publishing on any of the titanium. And so I came back, and on my titanium project, we took some of our 1-inch plate, and we made the first Electro Slag weld outside of one research project in France and the Soviet Union, at least the first one I know of, and we made it just in the room next door, basically. It was a terrible weld, no fusion, but we found, wow, titanium is easier to Electro Slag weld than steel, okay, so far as that goes. So at that point, the Navy classified everything, and I couldn't work on it anymore. But this is an Electro Slag weld in titanium that was made at Oregon Graduate Center, because even though MIT doesn't do classified work on campus, Oregon Graduate Center took a contract from the Navy, and this is 2-inch thick plate with an Electro Slag weld. These are the reinforcements from the water-cooled copper dam, so on either side. And here's, I've outlined, this thing was painted, or I put crystal clear on it, and it's been wearing away over the last 25 years. But this is an Electro Slag weld on 2-inch thick titanium. And titanium doesn't have some of the problems that steel has with bad grain size and poor toughness. And so you can bet that this is one of the technologies the Soviets used to weld a lot of their titanium hull, was Electro Slag. And I won't say any more than that. But the next thing, you couldn't weld everything in the vertical position. Sometimes you got to turn it sideways. And so it turns out another thing that Gurevich had been working on in the 1960s, so we could add, I didn't talk to Gurevich because it was afterwards, was Electro Slag welding. And so that definitely was one of the processes. Submerged arc welding, who knows, but it was kind of expensive on the flux. But his book goes through for 100 pages on how to make flux, so it's possible they were using submerged arc. But you can get almost the same qualities with gas tungsten arc. And we did some of those first welds in this country. And here is end-on a smaller piece of titanium with gas tungsten arc. And I put a bead on this side and a bead on this side. This one was done with no flux, just argon shielding, which is the way you usually run gas tungsten arc. This one was done by putting a flux on the surface. You can actually still see a little bit of the flux. In fact, you can see on this one, if you look at the top, you can see where we started with no flux, and we had painted this little paint layer of calcium fluoride or strontium fluoride, may have a little sodium fluoride. And with the exact same welding parameters, you get this much penetration with no flux, and with flux, you would get 3 times the penetration. And so this, the Soviets called this semi-submerged arc in their literature, but it wasn't submerged arc like the stuff I had been working on. It was what we now call deep TIG. TIG stands for tungsten inert gas. It's the colloquialism. You could call it, if you want, deep gas tungsten arc. And what happens is, if you use a little bit of these fluoride fluxes, and you were, let's say you wanted to weld something that was 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick in the horizontal position, if you did a joint prep, it looks like this. And it turns out the Navy went out and started funding some work at Edison. I don't know if it's Edison Welding Institute or Ohio State. Again, it was somewhat classified early on, but it's been declassified now. It's a lot of the oil companies have come in and paid for this type of research. You could make a weld with a little layer of flux inside this channel, okay? And you could use up to 1,000 amps. Ordinarily, for gas tungsten arc that's not deep TIG, you might not use more than 150 or 200 amps. Okay, you use a tungsten electrode that's about the. This is not a tungsten electrode, but you might use something that's 3/32 of an inch in diameter for regular gas tungsten arc. For deep TIG, you might use something that's a 1/4 inch in diameter. You might use a tungsten that looks almost like this. Okay, and get 1,000 amps through it, and you can weld something. It could be a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch deep. You could then turn the plate over. You could weld it from this side, and then you could fill in up here at a 1,500 to 2,000 amps. And you could make in 4 passes, you could weld 1.5 or 2 inch thick material in a horizontal position with deep TIG, which the Soviets called semi-submerged arc. So it could be done. People have been, they've shown you can sort of do it in aluminum, but no one has a lot of applications for aluminum. And people have been trying to do it in steel for the last 25 years, and it sort of works, but it really works well in titanium. I mean, titanium has a sweet spot for both Electro Slag and deep TIG. What David Taylor had been working on was this one. They hadn't worked on this at all. They hadn't worked on this at all. And what the Soviets actually were using was probably the only one Soviets might have used was this one. So completely different welding technology, because this guy in the Soviet Union had a job, and there, you know, you kind of have employment for life, and he had become a scientist there and decided, oh, I'm going to do welding of titanium. They had applications from the military to weld heavy section titanium. He was just a scientist, a wonderful person, had no political aspirations whatsoever. The other interesting thing is, while we were sitting there having this conversation, the KGB agent was sitting right next to us, listening to everything and encouraging him to answer my questions, okay? Because they didn't want us, they wanted to keep this exchange going with the United States. It was a very valuable exchange, and we learned all kinds of things from it. And they learned things from it too. But I remember there was a group of, there was an exchange, and some people from the U.S. could go live in the Soviet Union. Well, who would want to do that, because the living conditions weren't all that great. So we didn't have all that many people who wanted to go live in the Soviet Union for 6 months, but the Soviets had a lot of people who wanted to come over here. And so there were 2 or 3 people in 1978 who had come over to go to Rensselaer Polytechnic, which was the big welding school in 1978. And they were working with Professor Savage and doing research there. And then in 1978, Nick Grant had a meeting here in Boston for all this electrometallurgy. Nick Grant's a professor here. And so I got, maybe 79, I got to meet, I was still an assistant professor, but I got to meet these people. I met, not Gurevich, because he wasn't allowed outside the Soviet Union if he wanted to go. But I got to meet Metavar and Pakadnia. Well, there are 5 people right underneath Patan at this 5,000 person institute, and these are 2 of the 5. Okay, Metavar was interesting because he was Jewish, and he was one of the top 5. It's very unusual for a Jewish person to rise that high. And Pakadnia was head of welding, arc welding, and I sat with Pakadnia and the State Department interpreter up there on the 4th floor where my office was at the time. And we invited Don Sadoway, who's a faculty member here, to sit in too. And we didn't tell either the State Department interpreter or Pakadnia that Don Sadoway's family came from the Ukraine. And Don had been raised speaking Ukrainian when he was a kid. In fact, when I went over to visit his house a few years later, and his 4-year-old son came up to me, he was speaking a combination of Ukrainian and English, because that's what he spoke at home. His son spoke at home, or his parents spoke to him, teaching him Ukrainian. So it turns out the State Pakadnia would ask me a question, I would answer it, or the State Department guy would translate it, and back and forth. In the meantime, Don's sitting there and he understands everything. And so it was sort of interesting, because the State Department guy kind of didn't get all the translations right, but Don filled me in later of what Pakadnia had really said. And In any case, there was a guy there who was our KGB agent host, and we all knew he was the KGB agent because his name was Marinsky. And if you asked the Soviets a question, we had like 6 or 8 of them who were visiting MIT. If you asked this group of 6 or 8 a question, everybody except Metavar would look at Marinsky first to see if he would, to get the nod whether you could answer the question. If you asked Marinsky a question, a technical question, he couldn't answer any of them. He was supposedly a scientist at the Patton Institute, but he couldn't answer a single technical question, and he would sort of defer or whatever. On the other hand, Metavar, who was this very powerful guy, he didn't care what signals Marinsky gave. He just ignored them. And the funnier thing about all that is the guy who was my predecessor's department head, but he was just a full professor at the time, was Mert Flemings. And Mert doesn't remember names very well, neither do I. But Mert used to call Kent Bowen, who was a faculty member here, he used to call Kent Bowen Ken, okay? And so Don Sadoway and I decided that Mert was not Mert, but Mur, okay? And so we used to joke, and when Mert wasn't around, we would talk about Mur, our colleague. Well, Professor Flemings couldn't remember Marinsky to save his life, okay? So he called him Marinchek, okay? It's sort of, okay, it's just, began with an M, and actually an M-A. And the funniest thing about this was that Metavar started calling the KGB agent Marinchek. Okay, and everybody, all the Soviets, everybody except Flemings, and everybody except Flemings knew this joke, and you just see Marinsky just seething every time Metavar would call him Marinchek. So they had a good sense of humor. Actually, they have a very good sense of humor, the Soviets. So anyway, I don't know that has much of anything to do with anything, but we were followed constantly by Marinsky. He met us at the airport in Moscow, and we had a hard time getting through customs, and there was some German ahead of us, and they went through his bags and they found a copy of Der Spiegel. And you would have thought that he just had plans for a hydrogen bomb, okay? I mean, everybody converges, oh, this is propaganda, and you can't bring this in and everything. Finally, after 2 hours, we get through customs, and Marinsky meets us just beyond customs. Obviously, he didn't have power over customs. But from then on out, all Marinsky had to do was flash his ID, and we could go past any guards, any policeman, anybody we wanted if he flashed his ID. Pretty good for a scientist at the Patton Institute, right? So everybody knew Marinsky was the KGB agent. So on the last night there, well, actually, one night in Kiev, we went to the opera, and they had a car pick us up and take us, Sekeli and myself, to the opera. And afterwards, I didn't realize it at the time, Marinsky says, oh, it's a nice evening, why don't we just walk back? Well, the walk back was about 3 miles. And I now realize the reason they didn't have any cars is because all the other officials were being picked up from the opera. They didn't all go to the opera at the same time. They might have been dropped off earlier to have dinner at some restaurant or something. But they all wanted to leave the opera at the same time, so we didn't rate a car going back. We had to walk back, which was fine. But the next day, Friday afternoon, we were supposed to leave. Or not Friday, Saturday morning we were supposed to leave. The next afternoon, and we had had time in Moscow, supposedly, where we could just walk down to this little market and stuff and see things. But the next afternoon, we actually had an hour where we could walk through Kiev, and maybe sometimes I'll tell you that story. We'll take a break here in a second. I guess the last thing I was going to say is these people that went to RPI, the Soviets that spent 6 months in the United States. I had a red Chevy station wagon at the time. And since I had a vehicle that could seat 8 people, I was asked to drive the Soviets, and we were going to a dinner up at the Winchester Country Club. And so I was driving the car. Sadoway was in the very back seat of this station wagon with a couple of the Soviets, and they still didn't know he could speak Ukrainian and understand it. But they were having a conversation in English, and And I could hear part of the conversation, and he said, Sadoway says, "What do you find different about the United States?" He says, "Well, for here you play sports for fun." Okay, because no one played sports for fun in the Soviet Union. If you were an athlete, you were there for the Olympics, and you were a professional and stuff. If you know anything about the Olympics and the cheating of the Soviet bloc on grading judges on figure skating and other things, alpine skiing and stuff, that was one thing was different. That people just enjoyed athletics here, whereas over there it was sort of a profession. And if you were good at it, you were sort of a ward of the state. The other thing is they couldn't believe. They thought everything we were doing was some big put on for show, and that we were trying to impress them. As they were driving through North Cambridge, and they had some nice single-family homes, okay, big single-family homes. They said, "How many families would live there?" And they said, "1." And they said, "Oh, no, 10 families would live in that Soviet Union, okay? Whose car is this?" "It's my car." No professor has a car, okay? So they couldn't believe any of this because it just was different than their culture. And the thing, it wasn't our car, but some other person had to stop to get some cigarettes or something. And he went into a grocery store, and the Soviets went into the grocery store, and they saw all the food filling the shelves. And that was when they became convinced that this was not just a show, this was real. Because they said, even in the Soviet Union, even the top authorities couldn't assemble that much food in one place at one time, okay? And they said, "Oh, this must be real, that you have this much food." But anyway, it was interesting cultural exchange. Okay, why don't we take a 7-minute break until 8:40 or so.